This week, the nation's largest private employer and biggest retail company, Walmart, announced that it would roll back many of the diversity, equity, and inclusion policies that it had announced in recent years. Walmart executives say the company will no longer use the term DEI, will no longer engage employees in racial equity training, will no longer provide data to the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index, and will not renew funding for the Racial Equity Center, a $100 million initiative from the Walmart Foundation that started in the summer of 2020. The news about Walmart's move was broken by this guy, Robbie Starbuck. He's an anti-DEI activist. Starbuck worked as a music video producer in Los Angeles before becoming a vociferous Trump supporter and leaving the industry. He now produces conservative videos and documentaries for millions of followers. Starbuck has taken to his popular social media account to call out corporations that have diversity and inclusion policies and taken credit when those corporations roll back their commitments. Robbie Starbuck has made videos about Tractor Supply, John Deere, Jack Daniels, Harley Davidson, and more, targeting companies whose customers tend to live in more conservative areas for things like holding bias training or having inclusive health care for trans employees. Each of these companies targeted by Robbie Starbuck has rolled back at least some of their DEI initiatives. Many corporate DEI programs, including Walmart's and John Deere's, were very publicly ramped up in 2020. Tractor Supply followed. Harley Davidson did have a diversity program prior to 2020, but that summer dropped a dealer for making disparaging comments against Black Lives Matter and released a company statement on fighting racism across society. Following the police killing of George Floyd and the wave of racial justice protests that spread across the country that summer, corporate America seemed to want to show that it was listening and learning. Later that year, job listings for diversity and inclusion-related positions shot up by 123%, according to Indeed, a popular job site. But then came the inevitable online backlash from conservatives. Those big corporate DEI departments began to shrink. Microsoft laid off an internal DEI team in July, and a company leader wrote in an email to employees leaked to Business Insider, quote, DEI programs everywhere are no longer business critical or smart as they were in 2020, end quote. Last year, Microsoft received a letter from 13 Republican attorneys general urging them to slash their DEI initiatives. Zoom laid off its DEI team in February, which it had launched in the summer of 2020. Wayfair also downsized its DEI team by nearly 50%, according to data from workplace analytics company Revelio. Now, it's worth noting that tech companies shed their DEI teams, in many cases in part of company-wide layoffs. But public pressure from the Robbie Starbucks of the world is not the only force currently working against diversity and inclusion policies. Bloomberg is reporting that, quote, corporate America is bracing for DEI's death, end quote, since Trump's election win. Trump has promised to ban diversity initiatives via executive order on his first day in office. Plus, anti-DEI laws have been introduced in at least 30 states and signed into law in 10 states, according to a count by the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is an education news site. And the Supreme Court's decision in 2023 to ban affirmative action has inspired conservative legal groups to file hundreds of lawsuits against law firms, government agencies, and educational institutions for their diversity and equity goals, often citing reverse discrimination. Now, despite all this, an analysis of 902 large publicly traded companies by the Wall Street Journal and the Drucker Institute show that companies with dedicated DEI staff do better in customer satisfaction, in innovation, and in employee engagement. And despite losing some ground in the court of public opinion over the past 18 months, a majority of Americans still see DEI as a good thing, according to Pew Research, 52%. It's down from 56% in 2023. And it's important to note that not all DEI programs are so vulnerable to public pressure campaigns. The supermarket chain Meijer, for example, is another large company that launched specific diversity programs in 2020. In 2008, Meijer was, according to the Human Rights Campaign, one of the worst places for LGBTQ plus employees and customers in the country. It scored a 0 on their Corporate Equality Index. But Meijer amended its company policies and has fully rebounded. HRC now gives it a perfect score. It also committed to supplier diversity, one of the many policies that Walmart has backed away from this week, buying goods from companies that are majority owned by women, minorities, or disabled people, or members of the LGBTQ+ community. Simultaneously, Meijer is expanding. It's opening new stores. It's growing its business. Diversity and inclusion programs are good for business, and they do work. But they are more likely to last when they're enacted by a company that means it when they say that they want to have a diverse workplace or to create more equitable leadership structures. Perhaps this is what's behind Meijer's relative success in this arena, and perhaps the difference between Meijer and some of these companies whose diversity efforts seem so much more vulnerable to political pressure is that Meijer launched these policies with less fanfare and more deliberation. As the Harvard Business Review writes, quote, leaders must acknowledge that increasing demographic diversity does not by itself increase effectiveness. What matters is how an organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape its power structure, end quote. Well, whether it's willing to reshape its power structure. Joining me now is Jennifer Piscopo. She's a professor of gender and politics at the Royal Holloway University of London. She's a director of the school's Gender Institute. And Adia Wingfield is a sociologist, vice dean for faculty development and diversity at Washington University in St. Louis, and author of the book Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix. Jennifer, because bottom line is we've seen studies that indicate that, generally speaking, if you are more representative of both your workforce and your stakeholders, including your customers, these companies do better. Why is the public pressure, the Robbie Starbucks of the world, why are they having more influence in that moment? Because companies like Meijer, and there are many, many, many others. That one study that I cited 900 large public companies. Companies do better when they consider themselves more diverse and more equal. Why bow to the pressure?
Well, let's first talk about why do they do better, because that's really important to understand. Because one of the things that when companies take diversity seriously that they do is that they broaden the talent pool, right? They think about recruiting not just for lower level, but especially for higher level positions beyond the networks that they've usually looked. They look to people who are traditionally different from how CEOs or C-suite executives have usually looked. And so the reason they perform better is in diversifying the talent pool, they draw more talent in. So these arguments that you hear from the right, that you hear from the Robbie Starbucks types, that DEI is counter to merit, they sound good, but they're actually completely backwards. They get the facts completely wrong. DEI is about broadening your talent pool for who you're putting in positions of power, and that's why companies are successful, because they develop better business strategies when they draw on the talents of all Americans or all the people in their particular country.
But that's where we're stuck, right, Adia? This argument that any of these things, affirmative action quotas, DEI, all of these initiatives are counter to merit. I imagine we can all find a handful of examples in which there have been instances where someone has been hired counter to merit because of an initiative, but the rest of society doesn't actually bear that out. The rest of the examples of diversity do not bear that out. But we are stuck on that, or at least some people in this country are stuck on that narrative. How best to fight that? A lot of companies I've talked to have said, we just don't have the energy to fight it because those people, like the Robbie Starbucks of the world, invest themselves full time in this, and we've got a company to run. So how do you change the narrative without changing the narrative?
Sure. I would invite people to think a little bit more deeply about this question of merit, which I think is interesting, because the assumption that previously we were this meritocratic country where everything was decided based solely on one's own skills and talents rests upon the assumption that for most of our history, the most skilled, the most talented, the brightest, the most qualified people were almost exclusively white men. That beggars belief. That just doesn't sound consistent or seem consistent with the broad, diverse society that we have. And that's not really an accurate way of defining merit if your merit skews in such a way that primarily one racial or gender group has disproportionately taken all of the seats of power and the high-ranking roles throughout society. So it's not really accurate that we have historically been this meritocratic country and that DEI initiatives are somehow challenging or fundamentally changing that. What is accurate is that we have been a society that has systematically had biases in place and has structural inequalities in place. And that by acknowledging those and by putting into place policies and initiatives that address those and create opportunities for all to be included, then we are actually moving towards a place where there is more of a likeness towards and more of a movement towards meritocracy, because then everybody's opportunities are present. As Jennifer noted, everybody has opportunities to be included. Everyone has opportunities to compete on a more fair playing field and on a more level playing field than if we are systematically excluding certain groups of people.
So, Jennifer, Donald Trump's got a lot of plans for day one. He's going to dismantle DEI or make them whatever he's going to. You can't do that, right? I mean, if companies have organic visions about equity and inclusion, how would one even make that? I mean, it's different from having an affirmative action policy at a university. It's a different thing because there can be legal controls put on that. But you can't actually tell a company that it would be illegal to be more diverse.
That's right in the broad sense, right? Federal courts recently kicked back the Florida law that tried to ban anti-DEI completely, and they kicked it back on the grounds that Republicans had long fought for in federal law, which is that corporations have the right to freedom of speech. Most of the lawsuits, Velshi, that you mentioned in your introduction are going after these targeted programs, right? So a foundation, say, targets women-owned or minority-owned businesses. They're not able yet to go after a program that a private company has, say, around mentorship or diverse recruitment. I think the challenge here, or the worry, I would actually say, is that companies are walking back these initiatives in response not to a fear of a legal challenge or a federal obstruction to their work, but perhaps anticipating that the Trump administration will look more favorably on companies that is towing its preferred line, right? So Walmart imports a lot of their goods from China, and Walmart depends on selling cheap products to their consumers. Walmart might be thinking how it would fare under a new China policy, and would Trump look more favorably on a Walmart that has walked back DEI? This is actually very worrying from a political standpoint.
That feels like there needs to be a part 2 and part 3 and part 4 to this conversation, so I'm planning it right now. Thank you to both of you. I appreciate your time.